So I want to introduce Don Roberts, who's the program manager for the Detection Canine program. And he's been at S&T since 2006 and working in the space since 2009.
I want to appreciate the great turnout. I've always said that we need more smart people thinking about our hard problems in DHS overall, but especially in the canine world. It's wide, diverse. You heard about the expansion of our mission space in the last several years, so we're looking for good ideas. That's what this event is all about, is to hear from you. I will say that I'm not going to take my whole time. We're going to have a lot more time in the morning for breakout. We've got some time in the afternoon, but if you don't get a chance to talk to us specifically and get some follow-up questions specifically to us, we on the tables in the breakout session, or a few of the folks that you'll see in the speakers, have these cards. This is the website to follow up with, for specific. If you don't get any questions, and this is the email address, but this is the website that has all of our our snapshots, things that we put out, a lot more depth on the program, and so could after the fact spark some interest. But I'm only going to give basically a high-level overview of the program. I'm going to lay out at the end a bit of our research challenges. You can see by the agenda we've got some of our current performers, our stakeholders, and our customer set that are going to provide a little bit more detail into some of the main efforts that we're doing, and hopefully provide some more insight into the challenges that they face in these operators daily. All right, so the canine program overview. Really, our mission: provide the customer with the tools, techniques, and knowledge to better understand, train, and utilize the detection canine, a broad mission space. Our primary customers, who we serve, is the whole of the domestic canine teams and operators. Our main focus, as Jay mentioned a bit, with our expanded mandate, has been explosive detection. However, in the last several years, our mandate has grown to serve the whole of the department and the Homeland Security enterprise, which includes state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement teams that encompass the wider, larger disciplines. So, but our mission really is to improve the operational proficiency. That's the mandate. We're doing something that improves what these guys do on the end user side. At the end of the day, that's the impact that we want to make. Along the way, we want to establish us as a resource for this community and as a federal focal point for the research, development, test, and evaluation. So this is the scope. As you see, we've got a bit of the kind of Venn diagram is kind of to scale, but our mandate in the past has been the orange and the yellow, but the canine community is broad and diverse, and that's where we want our capabilities to impact. That's where we want our programs to start to expand. That's where we need help. That's where we need good ideas. That's where we need experienced folks in those communities. But we feel that the capabilities that we've built will serve that broad mission state. Will serve that broad mission community. But we need to address the expanded scope and the expansion in the operators as well. So this is our program capabilities in a larger sense. We've established these. We're looking to enhance these capabilities with your help. We're looking for better mechanisms to share knowledge and be a more effective federal focal point in this space. We want to provide better analysis tools. We want more, as I said, more experts, more smarter folks in this arena helping us solve these challenging problems and gaining insight into this sensor platform that we don't have a lot of insight into. We want to be able to enhance our capability to rapidly assess vulnerabilities, operational performance, and on emerging and current threats. We also want your help at providing, better outreach to the whole of the Homeland Security enterprise, the federal sector as well as state and local law enforcement. So that really is the scope, the program capabilities that we're looking to enhance and looking for more good ideas. Next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of our past and ongoing efforts, and I hope that it gives a better feel for some of our challenges in providing tools, techniques, and knowledge to these operators. So these are some of the examples of the tools that we talk about. One being our non-hazardous or a non-hazardous training aid. We focused in the peroxide base. This was a #1 priority from TSA when I took over the program in 2009. What I want to emphasize is this type of product, especially in the explosive realm, takes years of development. That's where it takes to provide what we say in this program is statistically significant, scientifically rigorous validation of this data set in order to verify that this product, is a good alternative, especially in the explosive realm. We can't be wrong. So we have to do this kind of extensive test and evaluation, not only laboratory, but verified with the detector set. In this case, the gold standard has been in being able to imprint with this type of training aid, then validate that it gets the base material. This is the gold standard. This is why it takes so long. We want to be able to shrink that development time in getting these products out to the end user. Look for new and innovative ways to get these products out, get them cheaper. In this case, TSA is taking the lead in driving the economy of scale, but we want better ideas to get these things affordable to the state and local law enforcement, the communities, the counties, the municipalities that have 2, 3 dogs. That's where we got to get innovation in shrinking the development time and cost to market. Some of the other tools that we have are using and are looking for further innovation and great ideas is laboratory techniques to see where the canine works. Down below the level of the detection of the canine at room temperature. That's where our detectors work. That's what we need laboratory support for, especially with these low vapor pressure odors. These things that we had to develop this technology, this technique. When we were developing these training aids to confirm that we had something there, at room temperature. But we've also used this to measure the effects of concealment. What kind of odor availability is there when we're getting artful concealment methods. If there's no detection, there are no odor, there's no detection with this platform. So sometimes we're asking these operators to fill a gap that they just can't do with this detector. And we need better insight into that. We need these tools to be able to do that in the lab and then take them out and run them by the detector to see whether we've got confirmation on that. So, we're looking for more innovation in the laboratory for that. We've also used this tool at this level of detection to determine whether we've got cross-contamination in explosive training aid storage. That's a key piece. Are these operators really truly training their detectors on what they think they are? Or, so we've done multi-agency test where we've brought a number of operators training aids to the machine to be able to see that there was, or we did see that there was cross-contamination. So we've got tools to do a bit of this now. We need better tools. We need it, out there supporting some other ideas that we have. Some of these things, the Ready event, it's in training tools. We look at it, this is a tool that we're using for our outreach with state and local law enforcement. You're going to hear a little bit more about that later in our state and local outreach, but we use that, and I think that should be of interest for some of the state and local operators here. We're looking for more partnerships with the state and local operators, and our Ready events have been that mechanism and that tool for that. One other tool that we've used in our test and evaluation has been this MACE tool. It's a tablet-based data collection tool. It allows us during the test, the touch screen ability to follow the dogs as they're working in odor recognition, in operations, and the key piece with this is it allows us to have real-time results shown and looked at during the test, and instead of shuffling papers and going and calculating, it allows us. It's been a very effective and efficient tool at a lot of the testing that we've done with our operators. Okay, some of the techniques that we've talked about in tools, techniques, and knowledge really are independent operational test and evaluation efforts. We feel that they're unique. Our methods and our data collection, we employ scientifically rigorous. Again, you're going to hear me say that a couple of times. Statistically significant. We get repeatability. It's not just a one-off test that the dog happened to be have a cold that day. We have no clue. That does not give us insight into how this detection system works on a given day, what we can rely on. So we're looking for more innovation and effective ways to measure operational performance. Again, we want to be able in our scope to inform training more effectively, more efficiently at the end of the day to impact operational performance. That's the mandate of the program. We're looking at the training and operations, the person search. You're going to hear a little bit more about that. That's an effort we took on back in 2012 with a partnership with University of Maryland Police Department. We have several of these partnerships to be able not only to have operational detectors out there that we can go and prove some of our R&D concepts, like early proof concepts of our training aids and non-hazardous training aids, but also in this case we're utilizing them to prove out a training methodology, a maintenance burden to these teams, and bottom line, we're able to do a parametric assessment of these person search dogs. And that was something that I think more and more folks in the operations side are starting to think, especially for the soft target crowded places, that we need these types of canines to support this realm. We're in the business of understanding what that can do for the operators, what the operators can rely on. So that's something that collecting this parametric data set, over the course of the years we've been working with them, it's a long-term research project. We'd like to be able to do that more efficiently. So, ideas in that realm, but other things, tools for these PB guys. We've been working with TSA, and you'll hear from the training center. TSA has put themselves out there and really challenging themselves to get better in the operations, and that's where our independent test and evaluation efforts in developing the passenger screening canine teams, they have tested, they've tweaked the training. You'll hear about some of the issues that the TSA training folks have, and then they've tested again, and that's how they improve upon, and not only what they're training and the efficiency that they're training on, the effectiveness of that, but also improving the con ops and tweaking that to optimize that. So that's something that we've been doing is, our techniques in the independent T&E, but we need better insight. We would like to be able to do these things. The canine teams are not like technology. We cannot, we can't over a weekend collect 5,000 data points and get a rock curve and everything's all good. That's not what we know about these canine detectors. They're still unknowns, and so when they're supporting in a critical infrastructure deployment, trying to get an operation or a performance we can rely on, we really need to do this over a long term. So innovation, help with those ideas, that is what we're looking for. A rapid response to emerging threats. I mentioned a bit of that earlier in a capability. This is a capability we have. We've supported TSA and the state and locals that, by these partnerships that we've established and looking to establish more, we can go to some operators and gather 50 dog teams in a region and see if the basic maintenance training is allowing a capability on a particular emerging threat that we have. We've done this over the years. We can get answers in a couple of weeks with these partnerships that we built. It's a very valuable entity and technique that we've developed. But again, we're looking for innovation and ideas in maximizing and making that capability more efficient. Odor generalization is really, an effort that we did with the TSA Training Center. It's a unique place there. It allows us to have access to not onesie, twosie dogs, but we were able to get 70+ dogs in this study to really see that if we imprint a green dog that hasn't been exposed to explosive odor before, on a smaller set of odors, this was focused on explosives, can they generalize to a larger set? These family of odor theories have been around a long time, but too many studies come with very hard and fast conclusions, but they had 4 dogs, and they're not working dogs, they're shelter dogs. So we have to make sure that we're providing the best information for these operators to build and grow and improve their programs. So this was another effort that we've done, but we're looking for other efforts. We, again, want to inform how to make their job easier, how to make their training more effective and more efficient. In the knowledge area, really, this is probably an area that we can use the most innovation and help with. We kind of lump the understanding of the basic structure and function in this area, the more of the basic research. You'll hear more from Dr. Carey a little later in her talk about our efforts that Jay mentioned that Congress is helping us. That was one of the areas that they've directed us to look into, and in the breeding and early learning and selection and the genetics work. Carrie's going to talk a little bit about that at the end, so I'm not qualified nor to talk about that a bit. Carrie's much smarter than I am in that area. But one of the things that we do is sharing knowledge, is doing some studies that inform some best practices and going towards standardization about these storage and handling. Really, we did some laboratory efforts to really evaluate a number of different storage efforts that the community was using, and came to validate that the way TSA was doing things, the way FPS was doing things, was pretty good way to do things. But again, we have some validation in that, and that's kind of the knowledge that we want to be able to share. In the more basic research, early learning, Megan mentioned the Silicon Valley innovative program. We're supporting CBP. A requirement came out from CBP to have real-time monitoring of health effects in the CBP dogs working in a more physically stressful environment. They wanted a broad brush, but folks at TSA will tell you that their dogs go walking in the airport, so it's not a physically stressful environment necessarily. But this was something that CBP wanted as bubbled up as a requirement to the Silicon Valley folks. So we're working that with a small company that has a unique solution. As Megan said, these are couple of people, companies that have some good ideas. So the scope is not just the larger companies, but it is, as Megan showed, we're trying to make doing business with us easier and a bit more, end of the day, do things that impact our operators. So that's really all the programmatic work. I kind of showed at a high level of what we have done, what we are doing. There's a lot of folks working in this area, in the federal side supporting this. FBI, ATF, others that are serving this community. They're working hard, but as everyone in this room knows, there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of unanswered questions. So I'm hoping that these these areas, and the talks coming later will spark some interest and innovation for us going forward. But you put the next one, please. We've tried to frame out a few of our research challenges as we see it. I'm hoping this is not the limit of what's going through everybody's head, but hey, I've got great ideas, but we kind of wanted to put this out here as our research challenges, that we want to have more dialogue. We're going to have a little bit more time, in the morning break. I think most of the meaningful discussions happen during these networking breaks, so I'm glad that Megan, her team factored these in, and our breakout sessions later today. But, what we're looking at here is really fitting in two areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but, one is, optimizing our training methodology. I've said that we want to be able to have these guys train more effectively, more efficiently, tools, techniques, and knowledge to do that. End of the day, improving deployment strategies. How can we tweak some of the con ops to maximize our operational performance? What are some of the tools, techniques, and knowledge we can utilize to do that? The other one is really, can we get better at understanding what nature has provided us in this, the best, most flexible, mobile, versatile odor detection tool we have at our disposal, in supporting the Homeland Security mission. We haven't been able, we're just getting able to challenge the laboratory community in seeing below their level of detection at room temperature. So, this is where I think is a broad area of research that's unexplored. You saw that we're not just explosives anymore. We have a broad mandate to support the whole of the community. So that's where I think we really have the areas for growth. So I think that brings us to our break, the aforementioned. What I'd like to do is leave this slide up here, during the break. Everybody can ask us what we mean by some of these things. It's totally fine. But afterward, we'll reconvene and we'll hear from, like I said, some of our current program performers and stakeholders and customers who will lay out and hopefully provide a bit more insight into some of our main efforts and into the challenges they face, and spark some further in-depth discussion after their talks for the breakout sessions.